Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Icarus, and today I'm actually doing a book review, an actual book review for the start of Pride Month. I know I had Whipping Girl get posted a few days ago, but it was supposed to be done in May, and this was supposed to be like the first video I do for Pride Month. I'm planning on actually doing 4 videos, one every week, and to start with, I read Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin. It got a little bit dinged up while I was at the laundromat. And if you're not familiar with this book, this is supposed to be a grindhouse horror written by a trans woman about, it's basically a gender side book where all the men get turned into feral monsters, and all the men, if you have a high enough testosterone level, essentially, you get turned into this feral monster who only really cares about hunting and sex. So, devaluing these people, typically men, to their lowest, most basic instincts. And it follows mostly 2 main characters who are both trans women, and they have to constantly make sure their testosterone levels are low enough so that they don't change as well. This book has gotten a little bit of backlash because it's the book that burns J.K. Rowling alive inside of her house. And I have to say, my full honest opinion is I was very underwhelmed by it, to be completely honest. Underwhelmed, and in some cases confused and even upset. Mostly because I'm not much of a horror person. Briar is. Briar's the one that's expanding my tolerance into horror and understanding that sort of thing. But I used to be scared of the Goosebumps books as a kid. And never mind Fear Street. The Sixth Sense terrified me when I was 12, and I still can't stand red lights at night. That's a long story. So, with Manhunt being told over and over again that this was going to be an extremely scary, horrific, brutal book, I didn't get it. There's literally one scene, and I'll get into that later because I need to add some trigger warnings for that. And everything else is just, I don't know. I've read worse stuff in fan fiction, I suppose. But, so, spoiler-free review is, it follows 2 trans women, Beth and Fran, and as they are collecting testicles, because that's one of the few ways that they can actually synthesize estrogen for people. And the main villains in the books, beyond the world at large, is TERFs. The world has hit an apocalypse, and you end up having to deal with TERFs on one side and the wild men on the other. Beth and Fran also meet a single trans man named Robbie who ends up joining them, and they have a cis Indian woman, Dr. Indy, who also helps with the estrogen synthesis and is a big reason why they don't travel very far. We travel with these characters as they deal with an invasion from the TERF army, which pretty much drives them back to a bunker, the stuff that goes down in the bunker, and on to a different situation where they ultimately have to confront the leader of the TERF army. So that's the spoiler-free review. Like I said, for grindhouse horror, there wasn't much horror in it, for me at least. It is very explicit. There are scenes of sexual assault, and there are frequent mentions and talking about sexual fantasies, some of which is known to be wrong, that sort of thing, and plenty of explicit, dirty language, stuff like that. The action is, for the most part, decently paced. There are some major hiccups in some of the scenes, and the book itself is a very fast read. Some of the chapter titles, because it will do some things like, not all men, and then we're introduced to Robbie. That's funny, at least at first. And there are a few good moments in it. The turf chaser, Ramona, that we get introduced to, is a very interesting character to me. And I feel like how she ends the story is actually a very good one. But there's also other things like we jump perspectives several times, and there are a couple of one-off perspectives that I really didn't think need to be added. It seemed like fluff in one way or in another way to villainize an already pretty much explicitly named villain further. And yeah, that's it for the spoiler-free review. I would not recommend reading it if you are a fan of horror or you're a fan of trans-centered stories. Maybe if you're super into the gender side genre, where one half of the planet ends up disappearing, that sort of thing, I'd suggest reading it then. That's actually why I read it, is I want to work on a gender side story of my own, probably next year. But, okay, now that that's done, let's actually talk about spoilers and all, warts and everything. One of the big things you'll notice is I was going through to highlight different parts I wanted to talk about, but then about here I stopped. And this is roughly halfway through. Ironically, I opened the chapter to daddy issues, which I have, but don't worry about that, that's not important. Why did I stop? It's because I was note-taking the same thing over and over and over again. There's the green post-its are supposed to be for stuff to help me understand the plot, and I gave up pretty much immediately because they don't really go into the past. Like, how did the world end? I assume it has something to do with the fact that the men actually change into these feral creatures, and so society can't really regulate it. So kind of like zombies, except it's only half of the planet and not like everyone undead, that sort of thing. That's something that kind of irritated me throughout the entire thing, is that, and there's plenty of mentions of the history, and I think I finally nailed down that this was supposed to happen in 2019 and it was 5 years later. Meaning, Fran, who is perhaps supposed to be the most sympathetic character in many ways. Well, no, that's bad. Fran is the trans woman who is very feminine, sort of like passes without too much effort, that sort of thing. She's my age in the book, meaning like in 2025 I'm going to be older than her by a couple of years. And so I gave up on trying to follow the plot too much because I realized Felker-Martin was never going to give me too many breadcrumbs, which fine. I just wanted to learn a little bit more about how TERFs became so fucking prevalent to begin with. That's something I'd really would be interested in knowing. I have some markers. Pink is supposed to be what the fuck moments. Like, the very first one I highlighted is Fran having a sort of a wet dream, wet imagination moment, as the head TERF, Cheech, is very much ready to, like, kill her. Let's see, what else? The blue's supposed to be good moments. Good pieces of writing that I saw. The first blue one I have, and there's not many, and they abruptly stopped. Her legs felt like melting popsicles. I don't know, something about that line actually really amused me, so I highlighted it. And I'll read another one for good measure, just to show I didn't hate everything in this book. Let's see. XX had slipped into the vernacular not long after, a way for cis women to signal safety to one another. A little shibboleth to ward off the specter of the wolf in woman's clothing. I liked the term wolf in woman's clothing as well. Like I said, green was plot. Orange was just what the fuck. Well, It was what? Pink was what the fuck. So the very first, not the very first orange one, is talking about Beth being a brick. And if you're not familiar with what bricks are in trans female circles, it's basically she's saying she can't pass. And it's the first really big mention of. Uh, there's a lot of references in this book, and that's something that irritates me to no end. So, Cassandra Clare started off as a fan fiction writer. She wrote basically the Draco Malfoy and leather pants trope, and her fan fictions ended up becoming the City of Bones Mortal Instruments series, which good on her, I suppose. Apparently, one of the big things when she was writing the original fan fictions that she later on moved on from, she would include a lot of references to TV shows and books, and she would pick up lines and the like. And people have pointed out that in the Mortal Instruments, there's still a lot of that overlap. Some of the weakest points of Cassandra Clare's writing is from her writing her own stuff. And then there's that movie that is just all the 80s references in the world. I don't even remember what it's called, but it's the kid that's in the future and they're doing a virtual reality contest to try and find the source code, and he becomes rich, and it's all 80s references. And even Stranger Things season 1 does this. Like, I am trying to do a rewatch, or I was before I got distracted by Call the Midwife, and I noticed in the first season, it felt like every 2 or 3 minutes there was a reference to something else. It's like, oh, look at this 80s thing. We're in the 80s. We're taking such great pains to be historically accurate to the 80s. And nostalgia, except I wasn't born in the 80s, so I have no nostalgia, and I just got annoyed. Same thing here. It feels like the moment you start getting used to there not being references, you get hit with another reference. And then it comes like 2 or 3 times in a row, and then you go another chapter without them. And that got annoying, and it pulled me out, as did the J.K. Rowling thing, and I will talk about that. And it was very annoying. And the yellow that I put in here are just grammatical issues I saw. Not necessarily typos, but this is another really big thing that annoyed me about her writing. Felker-Martin has a love of the run-ons. When she has a sentence going, she wants to see how far she can push it, and neglects the fact that it kind of ruins the pacing. And this is something that I noticed in some of her action sequences as well. A very particular one would be in part 1, Beth and Fran are fighting on the roof with a horde of the wild men coming after them. And Beth has 8 arrows, so she starts describing shooting the arrow, where the man is, and what happens. And you would be like, okay, cool, that's going to happen 1, 2, or 3 times. Then it will cut to very quick bits before it focuses on like the last 1 or 2 again. That doesn't happen. What ends up happening is we get a paragraph and a half description for each and every single arrow. And that broke the flow of a really good action sequence. It was one of the best parts of the writing when I was first reading. And it broke the flow, and I kind of skimmed over where Beth fell off of the roof and started getting assaulted by the men. I had to go back when I realized that she was being sexually assaulted by the men, because again, they only care about sex and food. They eat their own kind as well, even though they hunt in packs. So That's a really big issue that I had throughout this, is she would cling to these run-ons and she would create what were probably meant to be really good, intricate world building, scene setting lines, but I would just get lost and bored and I would forget what I was doing. There were a couple of times when I was just like reading through the book and I would forget that I'm trying to take notes for every chapter. That way, if anything really stood out to me as good or bad, I'd have the notes to check before I started recording this video. And I would just get into a fugue state and be reading through it. Because again, it's a pretty quick read. The chapters are very, very quick. The language is fairly simple. It just happens that sometimes it gets tangled in on itself. And I would say every single time I caught myself, then I had to go back to the very start of the chapter and be like, okay, what did I read? What was in what chapter, so I can put myself a good synopsis on my feelings. Because that was another problem. There's several chapters where it feels like nothing is really happening. Nothing is moving things forward. And it's going to change. This should have been 2 books. Maybe even 3. And I realized I just said it felt like nothing was going on in some of the chapters, but while some of the chapters seem to contribute nothing much of anything, the entire premise of 2 people hunting, they find out that their city has been taken over by turfs, they go to the bunker is full of evil people, so they have to rebel against that, blow it up, and move on to somewhere else, and then it's the final turf confrontation. The bunker sequence is really, really fast, in my opinion. You don't get much of a time to really get to know any of the people within the bunker outside of the very small insular group that you're supposed to know and root for. And it just makes it very obvious of, these people are evil, these people are bad, they're not to be trusted, nothing is right, everything is wrong. And it's just like, please, I already knew this was going to be happening. You made that very clear from the start, because the bunker is owned by a rich brat whose family were like medical patenters or something. So it was very clear to me from what was going on, and I was like, you could have like maybe tried to twist it and make me feel like I was wrong before you then proceeded to show off that they were evil, or even like maybe the head is rotten, so it's rotten to the roots, but there are really good people in there. No. You get hit over a baseball bat the entire time that says these people are evil. Same thing with the turfs. Even with, there is a point of view character, I mentioned her, Ramona, who is a turf, but she's also a trans chaser. She finds herself sexually attracted to trans women and trans femme people, so long as they still have their dicks. And she is interesting because she does give us a peek into the world of the turfs. But the entire thing is still really flat. Like, Teach is the main villain. She is the head of the turf army, and from what it sounds like, even the Women's Association or whatever that has taken over Maryland are really kind of scared of her and kind of want her to die, not exist anymore. And there's no subtlety about it. She hangs up photos of trans women, from self-portraits to paintings to photographs of them, wherever she sets up office. And it includes Marsha P. Johnson. So there really is nothing subtle about it. And I think that's a shame, honestly, because there could have been a whole lot done with this, but I don't think Felker-Martin really wanted to give any nuance. Which does bring me to another problem of the turfs. There's 2, really. first off, they're speaking when they talk. It's exactly like what you would see in Twitter nowadays, or even a couple years ago. Their mantras and how they speak are straight off of Twitter and Tumblr Radfem discourse. There's no updating for the fact that they're an apocalypse. Not really. And I don't know why. Like, I understand they want to eradicate the men. I would want to eradicate these creatures that seemingly can't be reformed or transformed back, that sort of thing. They're a danger to society, and there's something that needs to be done to prevent people from going into that. But at the same time, it's like they're very single-mindedly focused on these sort of things, and I don't know. Would trans women be such a big issue that they try to devote their every energy to that? Is that supposed to be the point, that they're that ridiculous? And you would expect maybe some of the more graphic, gross scenes from them. And yeah, it happens. There is a scene where someone who is leaking information to trans-friendly people, she ends up being killed in a very horrific way that made my stomach turn. The way Breyer puts it was death by hysterectomy, which is a very accurate way to put it. But that brings me to a different problem that I had with the TERFs, and that is their Maniad section of their army of people who were born male, who have been castrated into eunuchs, and now they get to use female names and be called female pronouns. The insinuation is these people may have been trans women or non-binary, or maybe they were even cis men who willingly gave up their testicles so that they wouldn't transform, and ended up siding with the TERFs. And the head TERF says that they betrayed their gender and joined the right side, and so but that doesn't make sense, because they are chasing after trans women who are women by this definition that they are creating for themselves. They just don't like the trans women because they haven't cut off their balls or something. Meanwhile, Fran does want bottom surgery, so she would, by their account, by this logic, be considered a woman. And if it wasn't for the fact that they were calling this group sisters and women and giving them feminine names and using feminine pronouns, I wouldn't have a problem with it. Like, of course, castrate the men or the AMAB people so that they can't rebel. And yes, there are going to be quote-unquote gender traitors, because there are plenty of men and masculine non-binary people who do agree with what TERFs say. Hell, there's trans women that agree with what TERFs say. Just look at Blair White. So the idea of a castrated eunuch section of the military doesn't surprise me. The way that they treat those military individuals does. Speaking of men, let's talk about Robbie. Some things that I noticed, and actually this gave me some time dilation issues, is that Robbie is almost always written as being on his period. He does not get very many sections that are his point of view. The story is very much more in Beth and Fran's point of view, with auxiliary POVs as needed. But Robbie was introduced in the chapter Not All Men. He was introduced in a very stereotypical, and that's going to be a theme, masculine way of being alone, preferring to be alone, shooting down the feral man. And okay, that's fine. Then we skip to him going home, and he's like, I'm on my period. Cool, okay, thanks. And then he's on his period later. And then he's on his period later. He starts his period again. And it's like, I no longer understand how much time is passing because Robbie seems to always be on his period. So either we're like going forward a month, or at some point I think it was 6 weeks, which doesn't make sense because unless he has an irregular period, why is he finishing up a period? And it was very frustrating and annoying. And as a trans man reading this, trying to once again uh, give it my best shot, I was so irritated with the way that Robbie was treated throughout the story. I don't mind that he was not a perfect person. He has a history before the apocalypse of being extremely aggressive towards bullies because he wanted to protect and also prove himself as a dude. And as someone who has been dealing with his temper for ages, I totally understand that. But everything else, and then I think there's some unintentional stuff because Robbie is part indigenous, because Robbie is part Native American. He is specifically from tribes down in Arizona, New Mexico area. That's ultimately where he ends up going because he wants to see if he can't find any family. There, and that's totally fine. I'm good with that. The thing is, Robbie when he talks about Tonker, he talks about immediately feeling more calm and talks about feeling more comfortable outside. And yes, it could just be the whole not being used around people, being around so much estrogen, that sort of thing. But then we have Beth come in and noticing Robbie crying over a specific incident, and she has to restrain herself from asking if he noticed any litter. And I guess that was supposed to be a aha, very funny, what the fuck, Beth isn't a good person either sort of deal, but what the fuck? What the actual fuck? Anything from Robbie being better off in nature and better off alone, and then making that sort of joke. What the fuck? That wasn't funny to me. That was really fucked up, and it didn't add anything to the story because it wasn't even something she said out loud. It was just a thought she had that she was like, I guess I shouldn't say that out loud. And I was like, you didn't need to write it. And Beth is the most sympathetic character. She is, I believe she's a little older than Fran, and she has had a lot of struggles with being accepted. Right when the apocalypse basically started, she was at a queer home, and she ended up being kicked out with another trans girl because the rest of the group was really scared. There's also a lot of talks about leftist politics and queer politics and how people can get quagmired in the whole being politically correct and caring about people's feelings and that sort of thing versus the realness of just existing and fighting against the people that hate us. I find it really hard to trust a book that's beating me over the head with the idea of all the white women are bad sort of deal, because that's a thing. And so Beth has had a very long time struggling with being accepted by pretty much everyone except Dr. Indy, including Fran, who they apparently are very long term friends, were formerly lovers. She's still a little bit in love with Fran throughout the book. When Fran and Robbie hook up, it's right after Beth has been very seriously injured, falling off the roof onto a pack of men and being assaulted by them. And Beth wakes up and she is upset and hurt. And actually, that entire chapter where Beth ends up being knocked off the roof was a pretty good chapter that was about Beth's sexual frustration and loneliness, even with her friend Fran. So, again, I have to give kudos sometimes, though. I think that was the most well written chapter, and it had that one big glaring flaw, but it was the best chapter in my opinion. And I really think Beth is supposed to be the most sympathetic because she's like, I can't pass. I'm not conventionally attractive. She is clearly trying very hard. She ends up having a one night stand with one of her coworkers in the bunker, who then flakes out, and then Beth gets reassigned to Comfort, which is essentially sex work. And that was traumatizing for her, but she tried not to talk about it. But then it's hard to take her sympathetically when she says stuff like that to Robbie, or when she and Dr. Indy start talking about Robbie and Fran talking about how great it is to be conventionally attractive, that sort of thing. And another thing I noticed is in Robbie's POV, he's very quick to point out who is a cis and who is a trans girl, but Beth is never called out as a trans girl. So I thought that was just interesting. Fran is an extremely frustrating character. She is super femme. She does not really like any of the rough and tumble stuff. She abandons her friend group the moment they're in the bunker because she is turned into sort of a liaison between the turfs and the bunker people so that they can trade. And she gets a card that says XX, and she's just like, I've made it. And she does that again and again. She doesn't feel like she has a place with the greater group because she's best with the socialization and communication, and after the bunker shit falls apart, the only thing she really is able to do is to work with Ramona, and that is done again through sexual exploits. She is promised to have bottom surgery by the evil head of the bunker, Sophie. And Fran ends up dying, and I'm not sorry about it. That's all I really have to say about her. Dr. Indy. Dr. Indy is pretty decent, but once again, the writing does her dirty. The big reason why Dr. Indy can't travel very far is because she is morbidly obese. And it doesn't sound like it was a voluntary thing. It sounds like puberty hit and she kept putting on the weight and couldn't stop. She gave herself eating disorders. She married a dude who would constantly bully her for her weight, that sort of thing. And the narrative tries to treat that sympathetically, but it doesn't let you forget it. And as someone who is overweight, the way Dr. Indy talks about it in some ways just feels like it's meant to be drawing attention to her weight. And it's hard to explain. Essentially, the best way I can put it is in the introductory scene. We get from Fran the fact that she can't stop looking at Dr. Indy as sort of an object. And it's described that none of the chairs in the house have arms, which I don't think was very much a needed detail. Now, Beth finds refuge in Dr. Indy's weight, which is fine because, more to love, that sort of deal. But the way that the narrative treats Dr. Indy is extremely frustrating as someone who's overweight. I think there's a difference between drawing attention to it and drawing attention to the fact that someone is struggling, and then almost not glorifying, but acting like you're trying to be something special by having this very obese but very capable character. And it really feels like it's the latter. Almost like virtue signaling in a way. And bunker people, all white people are evil. That's all I can really say about it. Sophie is a blonde Barbie doll, and she has evil twins who are both women with pale hair, and they both die. And people that come out of the bunker and get away from all the mess are a bunch of white people who have no spine. The only white characters I believe that are more or less good are Beth and Fran. From what I can tell, Beth is white. I don't know if she is, but Fran is definitely white. And, Fran isn't exactly a good person either. And I don't think we're supposed to be very sympathetic to her. If we are, then Felker-Martin did a really bad job at it. And, but yeah, it's pretty blatantly over the head that all the white people are evil. There's not any redeeming qualities, really. And I'm all for, diversity. That didn't bother me at all. The only thing that bothered me was the fact that anytime a white person was explicitly described as white, they were either a villain or they were described in a group as being too cowardly to fight. I don't know about you, but I'm not exactly the biggest fighter either when I know that on one end there's going to be a bunch of men that want to kill and eat me, and on the other side there's a bunch of TERFs that want to kill and leave me to be eaten. Moving on, let's talk about the J.K. Rowling thing. It really isn't a thing. It's a little campfire story being told. It was written for the flair of being written and essentially for it to be read and broadcasted so she could say, I killed J.K. Rowling. That's all it really is. The actual meat of the story is Rowling holed up with some of her friends and some female militia people to protect her. One of the women had PCOS. She changed. She knocked in the ensuing fight. Gasoline or gas lanterns got knocked over. The house got set on fire, and that's it. That's the whole story. It's nothing remarkable. It's literally just a marketing ploy. But it worked because I bought the book, because I heard about it because of that, and I looked into it, and I was like, you know what? Might as well give it a chance. How does it do with representation of other people? Not just trans women or gay women. Not very well. While we do have a plethora of different racial identities, and all white people are villains, and we do have lots of trans women and lots of lesbian and bisexual women, we have one trans male character, and we have two characters, maybe three, that go by they, them pronouns. Which, yeah, I don't really know what to say about that. It is frustrating to read because it's very clear that Felker-Martin really wanted to sort of expand and talk about different identities, which is why we have two trans women as our leads. But it seems weird that Robbie's the only trans man in the entire book. Why is that? Why is he the token dude and the token Native American, and he ends up fulfilling all of these tokens, and then you're constantly talking about his period? And none of the trans women, very, very few of the trans women get talked about very much, if get any screen time at all. It's usually just, oh hey, there's a trans woman, oh hey, there's a cis woman, oh hey, this trans woman is also a brick, and she is trying to comfort Beth, that sort of deal. I don't really know what else to say about this book. It was a fast read. It did not deliver on the promise that I was told of it being a horror book. It was explicit. It did have sex. It did have sexual assault. There's a lot of very clear uh, allegories or metaphors, such as the feral men's dicks being barbed with bony protrusions, and it's very much differently worded than the trans women's dicks. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of the TERFs being overly dramatically evil, and there's a lot of disappointment. That's all I can say is this book was disappointing. It could have been something. It would have been cool to see, even keeping it as a pulpy grindhouse horror movie-esque sort of thing. Just focusing maybe more on the external horror and less on the petty and squabblings, because it feels like this movie was trying to do both the overarching horror that you get with a lot of the more crazy stuff. Like, Breyer watched a movie recently that was about a sofa that got possessed by a dude who didn't want to die with his girlfriend or whatever, and there's a sex scene with the sofa that lasted 2 minutes apparently. And so it feels like a cross between that and wanting to tell a more introspective story of these two people in particular, Beth and Fran. And it could have maybe branched somewhere between the two, but it didn't. And in the process, it tried to over dramatize stuff for the sake of marketing, and it really undersold itself on pretty much every other front. So, yeah, I don't recommend it. Can't say I regret spending the money on it, because it was a read. It's getting me back into reading. It feels like it's been forever since I held a physical book. But on the same token, this is the book I started reading again on. Yeah. So, that's going to be it for me today. Next week we will be going over Whipping Girl Chapter 10. And I haven't read it yet. I'm sure it's going to be fun. We'll see. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.